I am 35 years old and I work in an office. My husband, Brandon, is 6 years older than me, and our marriage has been going on for 9 years. Despite this, for certain reasons, I now live with my mother. Let me explain how I ended up in this situation. A few years ago, Brandon and I decided to build a house, which at that time seemed like a logical step forward in our lives. However, this decision coincided with a difficult period. Brandon had just changed jobs, and our financial situation was far from stable. We didn't have a lot of income, but then we hoped that the situation would improve over time. Previously, Brandon worked for a large company, but there he was constantly faced with subtle but painful ridicule from his boss. These hidden attacks seriously affected his emotional state. He began to sleep poorly, which led to even more stress. Eventually, Brandon's condition deteriorated so much that he could no longer cope with work duties. Pain and fatigue became his constant companions, and realizing that he could no longer continue to work in such conditions, Brandon decided to seek help from a psychiatrist. The doctor advised him to take a 3-month break to recover. However, even after this period, there was no improvement, and Brandon made the difficult decision to quit his job. From that moment on, our financial situation depended solely on my salary. This period was extremely difficult for both of us. Brandon was not working, and I supported our family as best I could. However, gradually Brandon's condition began to improve. He began to eat well again, sleep at night, and his psychiatrist was pleased with the rapid results of treatment. I was happy to watch my cheerful and loving Brandon come back to me. When he felt ready to go back to work, we started looking for new opportunities. Although his experience working for a large company was important, finding a new job proved difficult. The reason was his previous resignation, caused by mental health problems. However, after a while we were lucky. A small company offered Brandon a position. The salary was significantly lower than what he had earned before, about a quarter less, but it didn't really matter to him. Brandon was glad to feel useful again and to be busy doing something he liked. We have always dreamed of having children, but the reality of life and circumstances forced us to postpone this thought for later. We understood that if I stopped working, our life would become too difficult from a financial point of view, so I continued to work. In addition, I sincerely loved my job and found satisfaction in it, so at that moment we decided that we would live together. Our cozy but quiet world, with just me, Brandon, and my dreams of the future, seemed stable. Everything flowed smoothly until one tragic news changed everything. My mother, Sarah, was involved in a terrible car accident that left her paralyzed. Her life changed forever. Now she could only move in a wheelchair. It was a big blow to me, because she has always been a cheerful and independent woman. I couldn't stay away, especially since my father passed away when I was still in high school, and Sarah has lived alone ever since. Our old family home was full of memories, but completely unsuited to my mother's new life. It was burdened with numerous steps and cramped corridors that made it impassable for a wheelchair. Then Brandon, to my surprise, came up with a bold solution. "I can see how worried you are about your mother. Let's all move in together," he said one evening. The thought took me by surprise. Sarah was also surprised, but I noticed gratitude in her eyes for such unexpected kindness. I myself felt deeply grateful that Brandon had shown such generous understanding. Of course, at that time our future did not look simple. Brandon had just changed jobs, and we didn't have confidence in stability. Nevertheless, we decided to take the next step. We applied for a mortgage, knowing that this could be a difficult task. We expected that it would be almost impossible to get a loan, because Brandon had been working at the new place for only a few months. But we were determined, ready to overcome any obstacles. Not the first time, but after several attempts and negotiations with various mortgage companies, we finally found those who agreed to cooperate with us. Our efforts have been rewarded. The loan was approved for us, and we were able to buy a house that we had long imagined in our dreams. This house was the perfect embodiment of comfort and warmth. Its space is filled with the smell of fresh wood, and the ceilings are decorated with massive wooden beams. It had a lot of cozy corners and built-in storage spaces. Every detail was thought out to the smallest detail. We paid special attention to the kitchen, which was designed specifically for my height, because cooking has always been my special pleasure. The cypress floors gave the house a feeling of comfort and softness, and most importantly, the house was one story, fully adapted for Sarah's comfortable life in a wheelchair. Brandon and I were delighted with the construction of our new home. Every day we came to the construction site, watching our common dream come true. When our carefully designed house, which embodied all our dreams and worries, was finally completed, its spacious courtyard became a real oasis for my mother. She, who had hardly left home after the accident, could now enjoy sunny days outdoors while in her stroller. It was as if this place was created to give her comfort and peace. However, there were many difficulties associated with this beautiful piece of land, given to us by Brandon's grandfather. Brandon's grandfather was a simple but wise man. He always adored Brandon, and when he was diagnosed with terrible cancer, he began to distribute his assets in advance. Brandon's family was not rich, and this generous gift, a large piece of land, became for us, as we thought at the time, a real success, like winning the lottery. The land was only a 10-minute walk from his family's house, and we were incredibly grateful for the opportunity. But, as it turned out, not everyone shared our joy. When we informed Brandon's relatives that we were planning to move my mom to our new home, their reaction was, to put it mildly, not warm. Brandon's sister, unable to contain her sarcasm, laughed out loud and asked, "Why does your mother have to move too? What a shameless family you have." Those words hit me like a bolt from the blue, but her attacks didn't end there. She continued, telling their mother about our plans, and she, without thinking twice, agreed with her daughter. With insulting sharpness, she said, "If my son had married someone else, there would not have been such troubles." She added that it was terrible that her son would now have to take care of the old woman, and called me a real curse for their family. Despite such heavy words, Brandon immediately came to the defense. He firmly said that the land was a gift from his grandfather, and no one has the right to interfere in this decision. For me, it was a moment of truth when I was once again convinced of how different Brandon was from his family. His mother and sister showed extreme anger and dislike, but he, like a beautiful flower that grew out of the mud, always remained a kind and decent person. Brandon has said more than once that his family is a clear example of what he never wants to be. Brandon was also sure that his grandfather had given us this piece of land for a reason. He knew that Brandon was caring and would help his mother in her old age if needed. The grandfather distributed other assets among family members. His sister, for example, got a parking lot that was a short walk from their house. Although this site was smaller than ours, it brought in a steady income from parking fees. To be honest, I would have preferred to have this source of income, but a gift is a gift, and we were grateful to Brandon's grandfather for his generosity. Thanks to his gift, we were able to build a house without spending money on land, which significantly helped us get a mortgage. When the construction of our house came to an end, we decided to invite Brandon's family, his mother, sister, and her husband, to celebrate this event. However, from the very beginning, the visit turned into trouble. The builders told us that Brandon's relatives came to the construction site several times without our permission, examined the house as if it belonged to them. When they finally came to our party, they were late without any apologies. And from the very first minutes they began to behave as if the house had something to do with them. "This is Grandpa's house, so it's ours too," Brandon's sister said with a kind of authoritative tone. Brendan's sister came into the house without bothering to take off her dirty street shoes, although we offered them comfortable slippers. Instead, she chuckled that it was too much trouble and that it was easier to just wash the floors later. She and her husband casually walked on the newly polished floor, leaving traces of dirt. However, the most unpleasant scene was the moment when they saw my mother's room, spacious, bright, and cozy, with a separate kitchen and everything necessary for a comfortable life. "This room would be perfect for me," Brandon's mother said coldly. My mother-in-law, ignoring the festive atmosphere, interrupted our conversation and, with inappropriate audacity, said, "I want to live here." Her voice sounded so confident that it took everyone by surprise. It was hard not to notice the envy in his eyes. Then, turning to my mother, she added sarcastically, "You're lucky, aren't you? You got into an accident, and because you're paralyzed, you got out of your old hut and into this beautiful house. Isn't this a fortunate combination of circumstances?" These words hung in the air like a heavy weight. My mother, who always tried to maintain dignity in all situations, did not answer, but her face darkened with sadness. I felt anger boiling up inside me. Everything that was happening was unbearable. I wanted to respond to this cruelty, but before I could open my mouth, Brandon, as always, came to my rescue. His voice sounded unexpectedly loud and firm. "What did you just say? There are things you need to keep to yourself. I can't even believe you're part of my family. It's monstrous. Apologize immediately." His words caused surprise on the faces of his mother and sister, who, in turn, could not hide their displeasure. My sister-in-law looked at Brandon with resentment and replied sharply, "What's the matter with you, Brandon? It totally sucks to invite people and then be rude to them, just because you built a house and think you can now act like the masters of the world." Brandon's mother quickly intervened, supporting her daughter. She cast a cold glance in my direction and added with disdain, "My son made a mistake by marrying you. You have the evil eye, and now everyone is suffering because of it." But Brandon wasn't going to be silent. His voice became even tougher. "That's enough. It was your comments, disgusting and rude, that led to this quarrel. You said the accident was luck, and you dared to call my wife the evil eye." These words were a blow to his mother and sister, who were now standing in front of us, confused by Brandon's harsh response. My mom, who had been watching all this with silent regret, finally said softly, "It's okay, Brandon. There is no need to continue. I'm really here because of an accident. And really, I moved from the old house to this beautiful one. But your son has always been kind to me, for which I am eternally grateful." These words seemed to ease the tension in the room. Perhaps feeling some kind of guilt, Brandon's mother and sister silently left, giving me one last angry look. My mother sighed heavily, turned to Brandon and said with quiet sadness in her voice, "I'm sorry, Brandon. I'm really sorry if I upset your mother and sister. I'm sorry that I ruined the mood at our housewarming party." But Brandon, with unfailing tenderness, replied, "No, Mom. It's not you who should be apologizing. They're the ones who should apologize. I'm ashamed of how little decency they have. I'm happy that you're living with us, and I want you to understand that." These words moved my mother to tears. She began to cry softly, grateful for his support and love. Life in the new house was good. We settled in, and the neighbors, who had known Brandon since childhood, treated us with kindness and respect. For months after that unpleasant day, everything finally became calmer, and my mother began to smile again. It seemed that life was getting better. However, one day, when I was at work, my phone suddenly rang. We rarely called each other for nothing, so this call made me uneasy. My hunch turned out to be correct. My mom sounded extremely worried on the other end of the line. I could hear tears and panic in her voice. "Brandon passed out at work," she said softly. Those words seemed to paralyze me. Shock and fear overwhelmed me. I immediately called the hospital and, without wasting a second, rushed there. On the way, I tried to stay calm, convincing myself that everything would be fine, that Brandon, as always, would get up and start joking again, as he did every day. But when I finally arrived at the hospital, the terrible picture that appeared in front of me shocked me to the core. Brandon was lying on the bed, and his body was entangled with a lot of tubes and devices. The doctor looked at me with deep sympathy in his eyes before saying, "Brandon is in critical condition, and he may not wake up." These words seemed to echo in my head, echoing in my heart like a heavy wave. Everything around me became unbearably alien, as if I was in a terrible movie where I was a helpless spectator. I stood motionless, petrified, unable even to cry. My thoughts were racing in chaos as I whispered prayers, hoping that by some miracle it would all turn out to be just a terrible dream. But the reality turned out to be inexorable. A few hours later, Brandon died in the hospital. The shock wouldn't let go of me, as if the world around me had fallen apart into pieces, and I was left alone in this nightmare. Before I realized what had happened, my mother-in-law and daughter-in-law arrived. When they found out about Brandon's death, they blamed me instead of comforting me. The daughter-in-law, not hiding her anger, rudely asked, "You poisoned him, didn't you?" Or maybe she wanted to get insurance for his life. And her mother-in-law supported her, saying with a bitter smile that misfortunes always happen next to me, and called me the evil eye. I stood there in silence, as if frozen in stone, too devastated to respond to their attacks. But when my mother arrived, brought by a caring taxi for the disabled, her tears finally broke through the wall that I was building inside myself. Seeing her crying, I couldn't stand it either and started crying loudly with her, letting out all the pain that I had been holding in myself since the tragedy. However, even at this moment, the mother-in-law did not let up. "Stop these fake tears," she cried out in exasperation. "Brandon has changed because of you. I don't want to see you and your mother anymore." And with these words, she defiantly left the hospital, leaving us in deep grief. After she left, the funeral director arrived to discuss the arrangements for Brandon's funeral. It was one of the most difficult moments in my life to discuss saying goodbye to a loved one. The cause of his death was horrifyingly simple: a cerebral aneurysm. It was hard to believe that Brandon had been alive and full of energy just this morning, and now he was gone. When I informed my mother-in-law about the funeral plans, she coldly replied that she would not come. "Brandon has always been on the side of you and your mother," she said bitterly. Her daughter, my sister-in-law, also refused to participate. Nevertheless, a lot of people came to the funeral. Brandon's colleagues, his friends, they all gathered to say goodbye. Tears were streaming down their faces, and it was obvious how much they loved him. But there was neither my mother-in-law, nor my daughter-in-law, nor her husband among all those gathered. It seemed that these people, who should have been closest to Brandon, were so consumed by their venom and hatred that they could not honor his memory adequately. After the funeral, I received an email from my mother-in-law, but its contents only caused me confusion. Instead of words of comfort, she asked about Brandon's life insurance payments, insisting that she was entitled to them. I decided to ignore this message, too exhausted and broken to deal with her greed. But soon the letters continued to arrive, one after the other, and each was filled with demands for money. I closed them, not wanting to face it. When my mom and I returned home, I noticed a strange light burning inside. This immediately caused me alarm, because my mother and I definitely turned off all the lights when we left. I thought I might have forgotten because I was too upset after everything that happened, but the feeling of anxiety wouldn't let go. When we opened the door, we heard the sound of the TV running. This was even stranger. Upon entering the house, we were greeted by a sight that we never expected. My daughter-in-law and her husband were sitting in the living room as if nothing had happened. I stood there in complete shock, not believing my eyes. There was unfamiliar furniture and boxes around us that hadn't been there before. It seemed that the whole house had been rebuilt in our absence. My sister-in-law looked at me with a grin and said, "What are you doing? Why did you break in here?" "Well, okay, I'll forgive you for the first time. But we're taking this house, and we've already sold your stuff." I couldn't believe my ears. "What do you mean?" I asked, hardly believing what was happening. "Where did our furniture and things go?" The daughter-in-law shrugged casually and replied that she had invited a furniture resale company and they had taken everything. She added that she made good money on it, because the furniture was good, and the company gave good money for it. They grinned and said that with the money they had earned for our furniture, they had purchased a new one, in their opinion, more modern and suitable for their lifestyle. Who needs furniture that the deceased used? It's just bad luck, my sister-in-law remarked with false concern in her voice. She stressed that she was very attentive to such things, implying that it was as if it was her duty to rid us of old furniture. All our things were already neatly packed in boxes, as if we didn't exist at all. The daughter-in-law even allowed herself to mockingly throw, judging by the number of your things, you're probably minimalists, or just the poor. Those words cut through my heart like a knife. Every detail in the house was chosen with love and attention by my late husband. We created comfort together, picked up every item, and now all of a sudden it turned out to be useless to anyone, thrown away like garbage. My mom, Sarah, didn't hide her anger either. Her face flushed with rage, but she was so shocked by what was happening that she couldn't find the words. This silence spoke more than any words. It expressed all the pain that we both felt at that moment. I immediately called the resale company to clarify the situation. When I told them that the items had been sold without our consent, the company agreed to recognize them as stolen and promised to return them back. But even this small victory could not ease my soul. I didn't want to have anything to do with Brandon's family anymore. These people destroyed everything that we had built with him, and left only a void full of disappointments. But despite this, I still wanted to stay in a house full of memories of our shared happiness. While I was struggling with this painful desire to keep the house, my mother, looking at me with sadness in her eyes, quietly asked, "What would Brandon say if he were here right now?" These words of hers made me stop and think. He might have said it was time for us to leave. Brandon often said that in life it is important to surround yourself with people who understand you, and that wasting time on those who will never understand is an empty matter. He was talking about his family, his mother and sister, and I think I realized that staying in this house would mean continuing to let them interfere in my life. With a pang in my heart, I made the decision that I needed to move on. I quickly signed a lease for an affordable apartment. My mom was surprised how quickly I made this decision, but I knew it would be best for both of us. I arranged with the resale company to temporarily hold our furniture, and after a few days we moved into a new apartment. In return for the move, I made my mother-in-law and daughter-in-law promise that they would break off all relations with me and my mother. Thus began a new chapter of our lives, calm and secluded, without the intervention of those who brought only pain. Soon after moving in, I found out that Brandon had a lot of insurance policies. He thought about our financial security with almost manic meticulousness. He always joked with a slight smile, "When I die, you will be rich." And, as it turned out, he was right. He left my mother and me enough money so that we could live in comfort for the rest of our lives. A strange feeling of gratitude and bitterness came over me at the same time, because his care for us continued even after his death. The purchase of the house that Brandon and I made a few years ago was difficult. The mortgage turned out to be unaffordable for him alone, so I, working for a large corporation, issued it in my name. We discussed it, and I insisted that if something happened to him, the house would be auctioned off if all the mortgage debts were not paid off within 4 months. And so, that time flew by unnoticed, as if in a fog, and it has already been 4 months since Brandon died. From that moment on, I started receiving numerous calls from my sister-in-law Emily and mother-in-law Maria. The history of my calls was literally flooded with the names of Emily and Maria. Every time I picked up the phone, I felt uneasy, as if I was in the plot of a horror movie, where something sinister was approaching with every call. They were incredibly persistent, and at some point I realized that there was no point in dodging anymore. Finally, I decided to answer. Emily and Maria were furious. The house, which they apparently considered their property, suddenly turned up for sale, and when they tried to return there, they were met with an unpleasant surprise, an eviction notice that completely deprived them of access to housing. It turned out that after Brandon's death, Emily and her husband left their apartment, and Emily herself also quit her job, hoping that Brandon's house would become their new home. I suggested that they return to their parents' house, but they seemed to panic. And then another detail was revealed. Maria became so addicted to gambling that at some point she couldn't stand it and sold her own home. For the past 5 months, they had all been living together, trying to establish a life in a common house, but it was only a temporary salvation, and eventually they ended up on the street. The situation was complicated by the fact that, as it turned out, a few years ago, Maria and Emily sold their main source of income, parking in front of the train station. Now they were not just homeless, but completely deprived of their means of livelihood. Maria, with an unusual tone of remorse for her, turned to me with a request. "I'm very sorry for everything that happened, let's try to get along. Can you lend me some money? Please." But I knew it wouldn't change what happened. I remained steadfast. "I think it's better if you stay away from me. Do you remember that I was the evil eye?" "We are strangers now," I replied coldly, reminding her of her own words. There was silence after that, but I could hear her every word echoing in my head. Who was the real talisman of failure now? When I refused them, Emily, who was apparently listening to the conversation next to Maria, broke out into a scream, "You're the devil." But I, remaining calm, coldly replied, "Yes, I am the devil, and I was unlucky, so I'm ending this conversation." With that, I hung up the phone. In fact, all this time, for the last 5 months, I have been working with a lawyer to organize an auction for the sale of the house. It was a complicated process, but as it turned out, such cases are more common than you might think. The house was sold without much difficulty, which gave our family some peace and quiet. With the proceeds, my mother and I planned to start a new chapter in our lives. We no longer needed a big house. Just 2 women who wanted a quiet and peaceful life could have limited themselves to something smaller, but with a priority on safety. I remembered Brandon's words, which he often said when we built our house together: "People can draw energy from the sun, so let's create a place where my mother can quietly enjoy her hobby of reading in the garden." With care and love, he created a spacious courtyard for Maria so that she could spend time outdoors without feeling awkward. These memories were so heartfelt that when I was choosing a new apartment, I decided to find a place with a spacious balcony where I could enjoy morning coffee and reading in the sun, as if continuing the care that my husband showed. The apartment was smaller than our previous house, but its cozy, spacious rooms were perfect for accommodating the furniture that Brandon and I had chosen so carefully. His contribution to our common future was invaluable. We were even able to sell the house for more than we expected, due to the fact that the piece of land given to us by Brandon's grandfather turned out to be very expensive. This money has allowed us to move forward confidently. I recently purchased a luxury condominium with exceptional security features, which has become a real haven for my mother and me. This choice would undoubtedly have comforted my always prudent husband, Brandon. Living in a place that gives peace of mind, especially after everything that happened to my family, is priceless. After he left, life changed not only for me, but for everyone around me. My days were filled not only with grief, but also with constant struggle with the consequences of what his family had left behind. The auction of the house ended, and all this time I watched as Brandon's mother, Maria, and his sister Emily found themselves in a desperate situation, without housing, funds, and even the slightest understanding of how to move on. Their desperate attempts to borrow money from neighbors or get help were unsuccessful. Eventually, they found shelter in public housing. But even there, in the new environment, they continued to follow their old habits, which led to conflicts and discontent on the part of local residents. Their carelessness and disregard for order were, as always, obvious. Even their attempt to have a barbecue on the tiny balcony caused a real stir among the neighbors. Such indiscretion only increased their sense of indifference to how their actions affected others. Their financial difficulties caused frequent loud quarrels that disrupted the night's tranquility, and this only added tension to their already hectic lives. When Emily's husband left her, leaving her alone with Maria, their situation became even more difficult. The life they led contrasted with the quiet and stable life my mother and I now enjoyed. We were also just two women in the house, but our house became a real refuge, unlike theirs, a source of endless conflict and anxiety. Their behavior became so destructive that the neighbors began to unite in the hope of getting them evicted and returning the former calm to their home. This is a harsh reminder that a person who creates chaos around himself inevitably becomes unwanted wherever he finds himself. Reflecting on all these events, I am more and more convinced of the validity of the phrase, "What you sow, you reap." I strive to live quietly and peacefully, away from the chaos that inevitably followed Brandon's family. Perhaps he is watching us from the sky, with a sad smile, seeing the chaos that continues to reign in the lives of his relatives, and comparing it with the harmony and tranquility that he loved so much during his lifetime. It has become important for me not only to move forward, but also to strive to live my life in such a way that it does not harm others. I try to honor Brandon's memory not only with words, but also with actions, living my life with dignity and respect for others. He has always been a proponent of surrounding himself with people who bring joy and understanding, and despite the difficult dynamics in his family, he himself has always strived for harmony. That's why I want to create a life filled with positivity and peace, because it would be the best tribute to the man who gave me so much and asked for so little in return. The decision to buy this condominium was not just a search for a new place to live, it was a step towards creating a real shelter where my mother and I can enjoy peace, security, and mutual understanding. Our new home has become a quiet haven where there is no place for drama and disorder. This house is smaller than our previous one, but I appreciate every corner, every moment of silence that it gives. Here, in this new chapter of my life, I have found not only a new space, but also a new opportunity to rethink many things. I've learned a lot in these months. Perseverance and the ability to move forward, no matter what, have become my main lessons. The memories of Brandon, filled with love and laughter, support me every day. They remind me how important it is to live sincerely and with empathy for others. To live in such a way that his kind spirit continues to exist in the world through my actions and decisions. Living well is perhaps the best tribute to a man who has so generously shared his love and care without expecting anything in return. Now, in the peace and quiet of our chosen sanctuary, I am determined to build a life not only for myself, but also so that Brandon can be proud of me.